All right, I'm gonna take a wild guess that no one's coming. So we'll go ahead and get started. So the sooner you get started, then the sooner you'll be able to head home.
All right.
Well, I just don't want your home.
No, I understand.
All right, on behalf of the Berrien County Historical Association, I want to welcome all of you here and at home. Tonight's Passport to the Past series, Out and Proud, LGTBQ History in West Michigan. Now, under normal circumstances, we'd host something like this in June for Pride Month, but we had something else in June, tapped into another exhibit and things, but we kept the celebration going here in July, and we're very excited that Saugatuck Douglas Museum Director, Dr. Eric Gollannek, has decided to join us and talk about their exhibit and the history connected to it from Century of Progress. Once known, or actually I think it's still technically kind of known as the Fire Island of the Midwest, Saugatuck Douglas has become an epicenter for LGBTQ culture and heritage in the area, and we're super excited that we can talk about that, share this history that also affects us here in Berrien County. Before I turn it over to Eric, just a couple of reminders. BCHA's new exhibit, The Melodious Faithful, the musical history of the House of David, is now open and on view through October 2nd inside the Sheriff's Residence. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 5, free admission. Upcoming programs include our concert at the end of the month on July 29th at 6:30. Grand Central featuring Martha Karras will come back once again to bring their wonderful music to share with you. If the weather's good, we'll be out on the ground. If not, we'll be here in the courtroom. Thanks to a generous donation from the Gabriel Trumpets Foundation, this is now a free program to the public, but donations are welcome to support other events. We also want to make a quick announcement for you to save the date for October 13th, 2022 for our signature event this year, which is Masquerade on the Square. Costumes are not required, but highly suggested. More information will be coming in August and in September. I think that's all. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you, and I'll get you started on your PowerPoint. You just tell me who you want me to look at the next one.
Will do.
All right. So we're going to share screen. Don't blind yourself in the process. All right.
This is great.
Oops, excuse me. All right, we are going to share screen this bad boy. And when we have multiple programs running on this poor boy, it's not always the fastest. So do bear with us on that.
Understandable. Yeah, I'm in no hurry. We've got all that. So this is good.
Oh, there we go. So if you want to talk about the museum or wherever we're waiting for it to
Sure,
pop up.
yeah. So I'm very excited to be here. I'm the director of the Saugatuck Douglas History Center. And this has been a really remarkable program to put together. A Century of Progress, 100 years of LGBTQ history in Saugatuck Douglas. It's an exhibit slated for June of 2020. So we began in the fall of 2019 in earnest preparing this exhibit, like many institutions and many communities, really looking at the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion and thinking, 50 years, this is historically significant. Let's look back on its history in a community that is well known as an inclusive home for all, particularly for gay and lesbian folk. But for the LGBTQ community in general. Next slide. If we can get it, oh my God, History Center is in its 36th year, so we're a newer local history organization compared to some, especially given the history of the community that, like here in Springs, goes back into the first part of the 19th century in terms of European American migrants coming into the area. The mission of the Saugatuck Douglas History Center is to preserve local history, and inspire learning to inform and improve our community. We manage two main sites, which we'll see a little more about in a moment, but the Douglas Union School building, constructed in 1866, was a multi-classroom school building that the History Center acquired in the early 2000s and rehabilitated and saved, and is now our galleries, archives, and office and meeting space. And that is the home of Essential Progress exhibit I'll be sharing more about this evening. Next slide.
This, like I said, this is the only this computer.
That's all right. I'll try to pace things as we go and work some material in. I wasn't sure how many people in our audience would be familiar, how familiar everyone would be with Saugatuck, but a big part of the exhibit and of the story of the community is really thinking about what makes Saugatuck distinctive. And so I thought I'd share a couple of highlights of the history and culture of the community. Go on to the next slide. This is a view of Butler Street. If you're familiar with Saugatuck, it's kind of the main commercial thoroughfare through town. This is out the West Michigan Pike if we're traveling through along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Getting a larger geographic context, you can see where Saugatuck sits just south of Holland, which is interesting to think about in light of some of the things we'll discuss. But though about a 15-minute drive from downtown Holland, in many ways a very different history, very different cultural kind of cultural outlook. But the close connection to Lake Michigan and to Chicago and the greater Midwest and networks of connection are very important to its development, to its story and character today. Next slide. So this gives us a better sense as you're looking at this very fanciful watercolor map from 1930, which was produced at the time of the centennial in Saugatuck. It was first platted in 1830. And so we get a sense of the geography in this bird's eye view. And you can see that some interesting things to point out, whether you're familiar, whether you've been there or seen Saugatuck for the first time. One distinctive feature, it's a beach town that does not have direct access to Lake Michigan. So a massive 300-foot tall dune stands between, and the river stands between you on Butler Street and Lake Michigan, the most beautiful sand beaches that are there. You can see as well that the winding course of the river historically created a treacherous connection between Lake Michigan for steamship and sailing ship traffic, but also lots of elements of this as a resort community, a vacation community, even in the 1930s, even going back into the late century. Swimming was popular by the turn of the century. But most of the swimming that was taking place was actually along the Kalamazoo River and off the river at Michigan, or in the early 20th century at the Big Pool, which was exactly the same as this large pool, sort of Art Deco style swimming palace, some distance away from Lake Michigan. The automobile and the New Deal era works programs allow for a road that's built and for Oval Beach to be constructed, which is where most people go to the beach today. Sadly, putting it into the Big Pool. Saugatuck is actually really two different villages. The village of Saugatuck, Rock City, as you see here, they have crossed the bridge, across the Kalamazoo River, the city of Douglas, two twin cities, but very different histories, very different characters. You might touch on a bit tonight, but very interesting community dynamics within a small geographic area. Lots of division, lots of geographic separation, and I'd say privacy is a big part of this as well. Big part of the community system. Next slide. One of the most famous connections to Saugatuck history is the lost city of Singapore, which was first established in 1836, and by 1875, it's no more. They have exhausted the forest reserves, profitable forests that is along the Kalamazoo River and adjacent to the mill town, and the mill is disassembled. Parts of the operation are taken to St. Ignace, where it operates for another 30 years, but the city itself is abandoned, and it's also rapidly buried by shifting sands of large dunes that are along the coastline there. So you can actually see some of these things. Really, the only known photo we have here. Later photographs document buildings, perhaps from the mid-19th century, perhaps from later in the late 19th or very early 20th century, that also suffer the same fate as buildings built in dunes. Those sands are constantly moving, and without stabilization, they're going to envelop whatever is there. So a number of buildings that are buried in the dunes, some of them from Singapore from the 1830s or 1850s, others of them in this much later period. Lots of lore, lots of fascination from the late 19th century still today. Next slide.
Are the houses still there, or were they eventually removed?
A number of buildings that comprise Singapore itself after 1875, those buildings are many of those buildings are moved. Right?
Okay.
They're put on rollers and rolled down the road. They're put on barges, floated to Saugatuck. Some buildings certainly are left there as well, or salvaged, or
right,
for the materials. So this is a recognizable view. Unlike Singapore, which is buried in sand, this is a very recognizable view here in Saugatuck today. You climb to the top of Mit Baldhead, the soaring dune, looking over the town. And this is the village plan that's planned in the 1830s. It really comes into its own by the 1850s and 1860s. It's a working waterfront at this period in 1895. Very active shipbuilding community, wooden shipbuilding that's going on from the 1850s and 1860s into the 20th century. And you can see shipyards all along here. This is the Wicks Park area today. Over the Saugatuck. Here's where the Butler restaurant is located. Some old mill building, top 2 stories removed. And the view off in the distance is Douglas and what was the bridge built in 1870 and later the Blue Star Highway Bridge that's constructed in the 1930s. So a bit of orientation to Saugatuck, and you can see a little bit of the complex geography of the area. Places that are directly across the river can be 3 or 4 miles by road in order to get to that same spot. So very that sense of separation is an important part of the story. Next slide.
Oh, the interurban.
Another iconic feature in Saugatuck's history is the Saugatuck Big Pavilion, the brightest spot on the lake. This was opened in 1909. It operates for just a little over 50 years until it's destroyed by fire in 1960. But the Big Pavilion was certainly a real magnet of drawing people and drawing artists as well into the community. When it was built in 1909, it had state-of-the-art technology. It had thousands of electric lights. It had its own power plant to illuminate the interior and exterior of the building. No amplified sound for quite some time, so big bands, large big bands playing dance music and orchestral music in the pavilion. By its later history, in 1959, it's the site of the Saugatuck Jazz Festival, and artists like Dizzy Gillespie and others are playing in this building.
Cool.
And the festival is on kind of uneven footing, but they planned for the 1960 festival in the summer of that year. Unfortunately, the building burned down in May of that year, so they had moved it off-site, and they actually did two later festivals. They did the 1960 and 61 Jazz Festival. So popular music is a big part of the community's history and why people came to Saugatuck. You can see in the photo here, you see people arriving by steamship coming from Chicago, disembarking from the ship directly into the big pavilion. Right? People were able to dock right along that what was a working waterfront and shipbuilding in longshore work. Here we see people arriving now as tourists, in some cases coming just for the day or just for the evening, coming to dance on the ship, dancing in the big pavilion, dancing on their way home, or sleeping on their way home on the way back. So there's close sense of separation between all the rivers and complex geography by land, contrast with the relative ease of movement around the turn of the century of people coming to Saugatuck by ship. Several hours on a steamship, and you just left Chicago and you're at the lake shore of Michigan. Next slide. Artists, many coming from Chicago and Milwaukee, are also a formative factor in the community's history. We see artists connected with the Oxbow Summer School painting here in the 1940s. This is our other museum site. This is the water pump house building on the banks of the Kalamazoo River, that you see in the background of this photograph across the river. But in the foreground, we see artists out here sketching and painting and drawing on plein air. They're actually looking at commercial fishing buildings, which are off in this direction, fishing tubs, which are all still very active in the 1940s. Next slide.
So was Oxbow just the name of the school, or was it based off of where they were taking the students to go do their work?
Both, yeah, good question. Yeah, so the Oxbow Summer School painting is a reference to that bend, that Oxbow European curve in the old Kalamazoo River, which is the location of the school starting in 1914.
Nice.
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll say a few more things about Oxbow in a minute. Tourism by the post-war period really takes off with the automobile. So steamship tourism by the 1930s and 1940s has really fallen off in popularity. But it's really in this post-war period of highway building, larger automobiles, kind of a sort of baby boom, youth population that we see people coming to Saugatuck in droves, right? Really kind of overrunning the town in cases. But Oval Beach is this really automobile-centered, accessible beach spot that the road is opened in the 1930s. The beach is built in the 1930s. You have beautiful beaches. You can roll in here, listen to music, party on the beach, eat hot dogs and hamburgers, and kind of connect with other people from across the region. Right? Next slide.
We have a picture very similar to that from Warren Dunes.
Okay. Sure.
That spot the guy dated it based on what parking lot it was.
Right.
And it's very much like that, just rows of cars everywhere.
Right. Yeah. Big cars, lots of them. Packed in there. Nightlife in Saugatuck is another part of this draw, so go to Saugatuck during the day, go to Oval Beach during the day, and come back to the Coral Gables, or any number of other night spots in downtown Saugatuck, which really feature live music, particularly jazz, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The city, in fact, became so popular and kind of beyond its capacity, given the geography, they would close the city. They would prevent further cars from going into Saugatuck from the Blue Star Highway. So people would be parked out on the highway, walking in, and coming here to downtown, streets impassable, maybe something equivalent to, being on Bourbon Street, New Orleans, kind of the vibe. It's the way it's often described. I need something else. Next slide.
Coral Gables is still around, isn't
It
it?
still is, yeah, very much so. Motels are another key part of the story as well. And because of the West Michigan fight and Blue Star Highway, West 31, Saugatuck is really sitting on this major tourist corridor going well back into the early 20th century. Many small motor lodges and cabin motels are built over the course of decades. By the 1950s and 1960s and later, these buildings kind of find new life as kind of bohemian, more inexpensive housing, resort housing, vacation housing for people coming into the area. It's a great kind of border hotel here, the Arrowhead Resort, right on as you come into Saugatuck from the East Side Highway, still there today. So, all right, so I'm going to say a little bit more about our organization, given that background of Saugatuck and kind of what some of the factors are and what the place looks like. This is that pump house building in 1904. Which is the museum, the Saugatuck Douglas History Museum on Baldhead today.
Now, was that the pump house that was in the other picture in the
Correct.
1940s?
Yeah,
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. So we saw it across the river. You can see it here. This was a previous exhibit that we had looking at the history of photography and particularly snapshot photography. Next slide.
I'm very delighted that the root beer barrel is still there.
It is a great feature. We'll see the barrel in just a minute as well. We've done a number of projects beyond our two main sites. When we saw the photo, and I mentioned fishing scenes and sort of picturesque that attracted artists. The History Center was able to save this building, one of the last commercial fishing structures on the Kalamazoo River, and find a new home for it. It was sitting in about 2 feet of water in its previous site. Moved it a couple hundred feet away, and were able to sort of broker its preservation and put an exhibit together on the story of Demerest and his family that was the last operating commercial fisherman in Saugatuck. And from 1945 into the 1970s, and into sort of larger context of Great Lakes commercial fishing. Next slide.
So has the river widened then from its original point when that building was placed on the banks, or?
Just high water.
Just high water.
Just the lake levels and river levels, the lake levels. So yeah, so this is just a little bit more of some of the community outreach we did, working with fishing families to collect their stories and photographs and help put this story together. This was all done during 2020, the summer and fall of 2020, and into the spring of 2020. So it's kind of a fascinating project to conduct during COVID and kind of isolation for the most part. But we're still able to do a lot of this research, and maybe more able to do it because we weren't really open. We didn't have our regular facilities open, so we had more time to work on projects of this time and along the water. Next slide.
Oh, come on, it's the root beer barrel. Show it. There we go.
There we go. Other projects like this, the History Center has collaborated on is the root beer barrel. This is a historic 1950s root beer stand, hot dog stands, and roadside architecture that had fallen on really hard times. And the History Center volunteers were able to purchase the remains of the barrel and rebuild the barrel as and restore it to its former glory. So as of 2018 and still today, the barrel has been back in business. And so it's the city of Douglas owns the building and the park where it's now located. They have a concession there that has been selling root beer, hot dogs out of the structure for the last 4 years. Very well. It's an iconic attraction for the area and very memorable for people who were in the area from the 1950s well into the 1970s. Again, this is my home, my main home. I'm at the History Center, the Douglas Union School, operated kindergarten to 8th grade until 1957 when the new elementary school was built. So a long history in the community, both in Saugatuck and in Douglas. This is across the river in Douglas and that other community. Next slide.
This talk is going to take you 8 times as long because of the slowness of this laptop. I'm sorry.
We'll roll with it. I'll try and get in the rhythm. We'll just have you jump ahead. It seems that I'll let you know if you can just jump ahead. I have to say.
1922, that's my grandmother was born. Oh, there we go.
Next slide. The History Center, I mentioned, goes back to the 1980s as it's founded, was not an active collecting institution. And so a little different history from some other historical societies. We did not inherit a collection of buildings or a collection of artifacts or papers. It was only gradually that those collections that were built up and somewhat cautiously. Next slide. In addition to our archival holdings and artifacts, there's also a growing art collection, visual arts collection, because of the community's history, so closely tied with that of the Oxbow Summer School painting from 1910, over 100 years ago. Many artists connected with the school, as well as other artists who simply came to the area on their own and set up other studios, other galleries. There's an incredible richness in the art history of the area. It's very much a part of the community's history. Next slide. We've had a number of donors. We've relied on a number of donors to give us the art that forms our permanent collection, and we're really fortunate to benefit. Next slide.
Do you have a specific school of art that you're collecting, like the Oxbow School, or anything, or any type of art?
We are very geographically focused, so anything that needs to have some connection to an artist who is painting subjects or working in the township, working in the Saugatuck Douglas area,
Okay.
or has a strong connection to that area.
Okay, makes sense.
They've lived there for an extended period of time. Next slide. These were just examples of some of the programming we did during COVID, using our garden space outdoors, where we have a 2-acre site at the schoolhouse with exhibits outside, as well as space for gift programs, such as historical art techniques program that you see here, as well as online programming that we did. Next slide.
There we go.
Yeah.
All
There
right.
we go. Okay, so some key questions, kind of getting to the heart of the talk and the exhibit. The exhibit really came about in seeking to answer this question: how did or why did Saugatuck become a haven for LGBTQ people informed that it is today? How did that happen? What was it like? Was it experience of people identifying as queer in the early and mid 20th century? What is the story of equality and human rights for the local community? What progress, this idea of progress was a key question that was talked about in 2019 and 2020, and still discussed even more so in 2022. What social and economic progress has community made over the last 100 years, and who are the sort of path-breaking, prominent or not so prominent gay and lesbian people who made an impact on the community? How do we document those stories and those lives? Next slide. These are not easy questions to answer. When I came to the center 5 years ago, when I brought up the idea, we should do our next exhibit on gay history. I had reactions from our members and our volunteers and our board, the majority of our board, identifying with the LGBTQ community in some way, but kind of looking and thinking, well, I don't know if we have enough information to be able to do an exhibit on this, to be able to tell this story. A question of, if the time was right. I think for other members, the question was, well, do we want to be, will we become known as the Gay History Center? And do we want that? We're telling inclusive history. It's interesting as over the last 5 years to see how those attitudes have changed, in part with the passage of time and with the commemoration of the Stonewall Rebellion in 2019 in the first Pride Parade in 2020. But much of this research had also begun quite some time before this. So there was a lot of information, there was a lot of work that had already been done that we could delve into and start to tell the story. So in 2006, the History Center had launched what they described as the Historical Society's Gay History Project. And this involved going out to the community, to members of the organization and to the broader community, and seeking, what are do people have photographs? Do people have ephemera, brochures, posters, letters, papers that might help document real-life experiences of thousands of gay and lesbian people that have lived in and traveled to Saugatuck over time? What are some of the questions to start asking about political leadership that identified with the queer community? How do we start documenting? How do we start doing oral histories and interviewing people, recording their memories? That those will last. So this began in 2006, and as you can tell, 2006 to 2019, a lot of time passed. The History Center has been an all-volunteer organization for much of its life. And so incredible work done by the History Center, challenges as well of sustaining work that's very much dependent on the individuals that are attracted to projects in the state of the projects at the time. So we've been incredibly lucky. Dr. Jennings, professor of history at Central Michigan University, was deeply involved with the History Center as both a resident in Saugatuck, in Douglas, as well as a historian. And so we had the benefit of a lot of professional talent directed towards projects like this. Next slide. What we found as the project began, we knew a fair amount. We knew a fair amount of information about this period in the early 1960s. And in part through interviews, in part through photographs, and other records. We knew about one business in particular, the Blue Tempo House of Music in Saugatuck, which you see in the photograph here. We'll say more about in a moment. And so we knew quite a bit about this, which was a jazz club and bar where there was dancing, there was live music, there was jukebox, obviously there was drinking as well. And starting in 1960, this was a place that was well known in the community and much farther afield as well, that had gay and straight patrons frequenting the establishment. And so stories about the Blue Tempo, there was enough information that in 2009, 2 years after the start of that first gay history project, this was featured, the Blue Tempo story, tempo, like music tempo. Blue Tempo bar is featured in an exhibit at the History Center, the museum, the old pump house building called Summertime. One of the features of the exhibit, one of the stations, is on gay times. It's described here, and kind of explaining the fragmentary history of gay men coming to Saugatuck in the 1960s and what that experience was like for them. What were some of the places they stayed, or some of the things they did while they were here for entertainment and meeting other people. Next slide. Some of the reluctance of doing the exhibit, I think, came down to we knew a bit about this Blue Tempo story. There was a perception that that was really maybe the beginning of the story in 1960. And in some ways, not much, there's the Blue Tempo and then there's the Douglas Dunes Resort, which opens in 1981. And there really wasn't much information to work through before that time period. Okay? And so further research has gone on after 2009, 2010, and trying to piece together what do we know. And I think fresh eyes, looking at it, 10 years later, some more things we can say about it. So part of the work of doing the history, telling the stories of underrepresented populations, of marginalized people, is really being able to read sources in a different way, because it's unlikely you're going to find a newspaper story that's going to describe gay men traveling to Saugatuck in the 1890s, right? There isn't going to be a set of letters and diaries that will describe what that experience is like. But this was one reference that did emerge in the course of reading the newspaper. Saugatuck Douglas has a long-running newspaper, over 150 years of publication history, now called the Commercial Record, called the Lakeshore Commercial in this time period. Next slide. And so there's a brief newspaper, a brief reference in the newspaper here in July 2nd, 1897, that is discussing the building of a new bathing house. So this is here the bath house that's built in that cove area on the river, near the mouth of the river by Lake Michigan, that people arrived at by boat. They took little packet boats from Saugatuck and rowed out here. And so this appears in the paper in 1897. At last, a bathing house on the lake beach is to be an assured fact. This week, ALD began construction of a building on the lake beach west of Mount Baldhead, 18 by 36 feet in size, with 12 dressing rooms and office. The boat line will be the owner and will place the tenant in charge. Such an institution had come to be a necessity, and vigorous steps should once be taken by the village board to put a stop to men and boys bathing in a new condition on the beach adjacent to the park lands. So the story, kind of reading into this, is describing men and boys bathing nude in Lake Michigan, kind of adjacent to this beach area. And so there's clearly that's happening. There's a reference to that is occurring to the point that there's this bathhouse constructed here in the hopes that this will stop, that this will put an end to this. Okay. What's interesting about this story is that one of the main attractions of Saugatuck, in really most of its history of tourism, are the beaches, of course, but for LGBTQ travelers coming to the area, it's definitely beaches, and specifically nude bathing on the area very close to the same area that's described here in the 1990s, on what was called a private beach. Just to the north of Oval Beach on land that was not owned by the city. So next slide.
Gave the old ladies a thrill, I'm sure.
That's right. Yeah, it's not entirely clear how to read that account. It's ambiguous exactly what they're describing. They're not necessarily describing that there's any sort of salacious behavior or sexual behavior that's happening there, but that this nudity is a problem. People need to be wearing the proper bathing attire.
And it's very
going to be at the beach.
Well, it's very interesting because the way that it's described is that yes, the nudity is a problem, but the solution wasn't to enforce clothing rules. It was literally to build this dressing property.
The problem must be that people don't have anywhere to change.
That could be too.
And so this is part of it. But there may be other issues too. That's a kind of gentle way of saying there will be enforcement, right? Once the bathhouse is there and there's this attendant, that there will be enforcement that no one is going to be allowed to be on the beach henceforth, that this is now in place. Draw your own conclusions. Room for much further research. Hopefully more sources come to light. But as an example of nude bathing and the long history of this is from the 1970s or 80s. This photograph, and this is the entrance to the private beach that you see there. You could pay $5 and then enter this private beach area, which is essentially where the natural area is, the preserve, the dunes preserve to the north of Oval Beach. That you could enter there, and while it says public nudity will result in arrest, that is true. You could not be nude sunbathing in view of the beach, in view of Lake Michigan. But once you were beyond the dunes, in the sort of grasslands or dune area, out of sight, no prohibition, no use at all. So that was a common feature of a common part of attraction of people coming to this area from at least the 1950s and quite possibly even much further back. Next slide.
So it was basically an unofficial nudist colony in the dunes.
Correct. This area to the north of Oval Beach, that was what was going on. So, and the big part, clearly a huge factor in bringing people into this area, LGBT folks. It wasn't all nudity, as we said. There was, there was lots of sort of play of many different forms. These are photographs that came to the History Center, I think from the late 1970s, 1970s. And this is a kind of touch football, power football game that's being played by men on the beach. So they are very much clothed around the water's edge, where you need to be clothed. But there's cheerleaders, there's football players, there's a referee, sort of kind of fun, theatrical, playful kind of games on the beach, passing a beautiful summer afternoon. Next slide.
Oh,
sure. Yeah, and the beach figures prominently in the sort of visual culture of the area as well. Next slide. These are promotional posters from the Douglas Resort, which I'll share a little more about in a moment. But I brought them in to just reinforce the kind of potency of the beach as part of the attraction for the community, particularly for the gay community, through a long, long history. Next slide. Right. So Douglas Dunes Resort is, I think that Brianna had mentioned the description of Saugatuck Douglas as the Fire Island of the Midwest, and much of that reputation extends back to the Douglas Dunes Resort, which was established in 1981. As you've already seen, there's a significant gay presence and even bar nightclub presence going back to the 1960s. Carl Jennings, Larry's husband, the two of them purchased the hotel and opened this new resort, which is catering to gay and lesbian clientele in 1981. Next slide. It's still very much a thriving vacation center and resort. A number of other resorts and bed and breakfasts have also sprung up around this within the area built off of. Next slide. Another photograph of Blue Temple that we discussed earlier, operating from 1960 until 1975. It's destroyed by a fire in 1976. But was established by its founder very much as a jazz club. And jazz talent coming from Chicago, primarily really making the circuit from Chicago into Michigan, into Indiana. Artists coming and playing here, traveling among these different clubs. And it's really a destination for jazz at a moment when jazz is just really at the height of its popularity among young people and I'd say young white audiences in particular. Next slide. You know a bit about the Blue Temple from records and papers that are survived from an interview that was done by owner Don Davis. Davis describes the club as something that he created out of his own sort of pure love of music. And he was kind of, I'd say, reluctant ally of queer people. He claims he was very surprised that there were gay people in the bar at all, and that they didn't really appreciate the jazz that the musicians that he had in there. So he was kind of lukewarm to the whole thing as he described it in the 1980s. Next slide. These are some photographs of the interior of the club. What is unmistakable is that it was widely known as a gay tolerant, minimally gay tolerant establishment. Bob Dameron's address book, which is first published in the early 1960s, by the second edition in 1965, Saugatuck is listed as one of the spots within the book. It's a rough parallel. Many people are familiar with the Green Book, Traveler's Guide for African Americans in the early 20th century. Bob Dameron's address book filled a similar role of identifying places that would be safe or unsafe for queer people. And what that meant was very relative, right, to the time, to the place where you were. But in this case, this is the entry for Saugatuck in 1965, and the guy was called, and it says Summer Resort near Holland, Michigan. And it lists the Blue Temple Bar with an M, which, if you look at the letters within the book, means mixed audience. So it's not an exclusively gay bar, but there are gays for students there. And then it mentions an interesting beach nearby in parentheses, and also mentions the Elms Hotel. You see in this photograph here, this house we used to rent. And it's well known, kind of in oral history, we talked to people who were in Saugatuck in the 1950s and 60s and later that the Gammons Motel was a kind of well-known boarding house for gay travelers. But kind of interesting as you kind of unpack the Berrien guide entry, an interesting beach nearby. The beach is definitely a big part of the attraction of why people are coming to this area. And this is somewhere where you can go and get a drink and perhaps meet other people or even feel comfortable while you're in town, which is maybe a bit different than we might think of these as identifying places where you're going to be fully accepted. This is a place where you can be safe relative to other establishments in town, which in the 1960s were not friendly. These were not friendly for gay travelers. Yes.
What does the H stand for?
Hotel.
Oh.
So one thing that complicates the story, right, is again, the history of marginalized people. How do you reconcile people's lived experience with whatever the social norms were, or whatever laws were at a given point in time? So, well into the 1960s, Michigan state law prohibited bars. You could lose your liquor license as a bar for admitting, and this is language from Michigan code, for even admitting or having on premises prostitutes, homosexuals, or vagrants. So this was a risky proposition for Toe Davis, one might think, to have a club with a liquor license operating in plain view. Everyone in town knew that there were gay men that were coming to this club, spending time there, and being served drinks. And yet, the Blue Temple operates from 1960 until 1975. And as far as we know, it was never raided, it was never shut down, there was never any sort of prosecution, or it was never brought before the Liquor Control Commission to have that license taken away. So certainly there's some real questions there about how that worked. The story of most gay clubs and bars, like the Stonewall Inn in New York City, is one of frequent police raids and police brutality, as well as organized crime influences, payoff of prosecutors and law enforcement to kind of look the other way, so that these establishments can operate afoul of the law. There's no evidence of that in the case of the Blue Temple, but it does raise the question of how was it allowed to operate in this way for so long and in such a public way. I mean, the Berrien guide literally lists it as a place that you can go in a small town in West Michigan. Next slide.
Out of curiosity, do you think part of his reluctance to have that community in his bar may have been attributed to that? Like the fear that it could shut him down? Or was it just straight out, I don't like you, I don't know why you're in my bar?
Yeah, I mean, he claims he was surprised that, no one was more surprised than I was that I was in this little gay Bible. And this is like you applied to be in there, right?
Right.
So it may well have been surprising to him. But it's a tough question to answer. What were his motives? Was this simply, this was just business, and he was able to do a good business with this clientele that was reliable. There was nowhere else for them to go. If you'll say, was he just being kind of elusive in his descriptions? It's not entirely clear. Yeah.
I'm wondering if it's being a mixed audience, meaning there was just as many, if not more, straight patrons as gay patrons, may have prevented the raids in comparison to all gay bars that we were seeing on the coast.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly the community standards would suggest that this was accepted and there wasn't support for shutting the place down. Great question. Would love to know more about the history of law enforcement in Saugatuck. How was this navigated? How did that with this? Alongside the other kind of youth invasion elements. I mean, motorcycle, description of motorcycle gangs and, large, crushing numbers of young people and music festivals and things like that. Next slide. So in part to get at this story, we did more oral histories focused on the mid-20th century and in a recent past, working with Grand Valley State University's BCHA office and volunteers in the community receive training to do oral history interviews in the community, really looking to engage with marginalized populations, LGBTQ folk, people of color. Next slide.
So where did the funding for the Stories of Summer come from again? I wasn't paying attention.
So Grand Valley had some money in the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Nice.
Grant that they had received, which also helped support that. So we people bring things in, it's really focused on digitizing materials. So digitizing photographs, camera, but also doing oral history interviews, which would then transcribe as well. Next slide.
Is this an ongoing project or was this a
It was
one-off?
not. So this was in the summer and fall 2018. And culminated with an exhibit, which was at Grand Valley State University and at the schoolhouse in Douglas, the Gammons there. Interesting this year. So highlighted some of the key elements that had come up during that research. Next slide.
I see what you're talking about the motorcycles and the motorcycle gangs.
Yeah, lots of stories about bikers descending on the town, and I think an opportunity for a lot more research to kind of really understand, kind of dig into the kind of what those stories are really about, what they're saying about that moment in time. There definitely were large groups of people riding up and down with motorcycles. There's no question that that's true. But what that meant and how it was understood, very different part of that. Next slide. One thing that really came out through the project was the importance of capturing the stories of people as aging population in our community, which is a largely retirement community. These are the keepers of these stories in this area. So it's very important to capture those and also make them accessible. So one exciting thing about the Grand Valley collaboration is you can go on Grand Valley's library collections page, and Summers and Saugatuck Douglas collection is available there. So next slide. You can look into this collection and see, listen to oral history interviews, read transcripts of them, also view historic photos, things that people had. In some cases, things from our collection, in other cases, images that people brought in and shared with us. Next slide.
Well, that's a very 90s photograph.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yeah. And so we mentioned Carl and Larry earlier. They founded the Douglas Students Resort in 1981. We had the opportunity to interview both of them together. And Larry is still very much with us, but Carl passed away in February of 2019. And so it was really important to have the stories that he had recorded and to ask his questions and have those answers. He had actually come to Saugatuck and was a bartender at the Blue Temple. So actually have actual stories about what this place was like. And next slide. Another really wonderful part of the project was portrait photography that was done of all of our sitters.
Oh, nice.
That we did. So we have these great photos. Next slide.
So then does Larry still own?
He does not. Yeah, the resort was sold in the 1990s, around 2000 or 1990s. And so another group owns the hotel now, but the resort now, and it's still being expanded. There's even more going on there than there was. at its origins. But the community's history is an interesting one, delving into the more recent past, the later 20th century, which I think is probably the most surprising in some ways because it's so close at hand, and yet there's so many questions that come to light because we say, well, we should know everything about this period, and yet no one's really thought of that history until now. But Douglas, Saugatuck and Douglas had not had any sort of pride parade or pride celebration ever until 2019. And so it's in part because of the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, but also the passing of Carl Jennings. And I think that sort of clicked for people that said, you know, we really need to celebrate this history. We need to be really direct about it, acknowledge you know, the really influential people in our community that have made this community what it's a successful, inclusive place. So this is Rainbow Crosswalk in Douglas in 2019. Next slide.
So did you guys start collecting items from that first Pride to build that collection?
Yeah, we did collect some things from that first Pride. Next slide. It was interesting, you know, the wave of commemoration exhibits that went up were a real inspiration as well. So that was from the New York Public Library's Stonewall at 50 exhibit. This is elements from the artifacts from the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C.'s National Museum of American History collection. And what was interesting as we started to work on our collection, telling the story in West Michigan, was seeing like, well, there's a lot of parallels between, you know, what people are doing in New York, Chicago, what they're doing in Saugatuck. In some ways, very similar with similar kinds of ephemera and your culture type things. Your culture. Next slide.
I love 70s design.
Pretty great. Yeah, some great visuals. And I think as well, there was some encouragement looking at these examples, thinking, you know, we don't need to have like 4 galleries of story. You know, we can tell the story we have. We can share the pieces we have in the story, and that is powerful in some way. Next slide. As we started to work on the exhibit, we also thought some of these other examples from Washington, D.C., or New York City, also kind of inspired us to think about what are some of the themes that should be a part of the story. So the questions we looked at earlier, you know, what's the experience of people, what are the lived lives of queer people at different moments in the community's history, but then also what are the sort of political and sort of social justice or economic justice elements of the story as well. We had planned to open the exhibit in time for Pride 2020 in Douglas, and this is kind of fitting photograph of Pride Month in Douglas in 2020, which was no one around, everyone distance. But there was a Pride flag from City Hall in Douglas, which was kind of a big deal. It's not really been done kind of official, with official proclamations. In Saugatuck for sure, and it felt like a much bigger deal in 2020. Next slide.
Once you get that first year under your belt, then it just grows from there.
It just grows from there. Just kind of find that space. But as we put the exhibit together, we really felt like let's work with who we have, and let's not try to construct a complete interpretive framework for this, because we don't really understand the history at this point. There's a lot of questions. And so let's see what sense we can make out of it, what we have, what questions we might identify that may prompt further research, and might prompt people to share their own stories to help answer these questions. So the exhibit has a timeline format with local historical events in yellow and national and state level information examples kind of tucked within those. Next slide.
Oh, that's smart.
And then you get a sense of the scale of this as you walk around, kind of see this at a level. And there's room for artifacts above in some of the gallery space. Yeah, a little bit of bishopry, otherwise. It's a very compact exhibit, and dense with information, in spite of our efforts to make it as light as possible. The one thing, as we began, I think there was a sense of, are we going to have enough material to carry us through to 2020? And as this story, as it progressed, things get very dense as you get into the recent past and start filling in that national context, as well as what's happening locally in the 1990s and 2000s. Next slide.
What do you mean by, I haven't been to the exhibit. It says 1964 Life magazine pedestal.
Yeah, so that's not quite in the way the plan is structured. We do have a reproduction of the Life magazine story talking about one of the first sort of popular press news accounts describing gays.
Okay.
Yeah, so it sort of lays out this, there's gay people, and this is what they're about. Here's how you might recognize them. That kind of discussion. So the exhibit, we'll kind of take us through the exhibit, and we'll move this quickly. So next slide. Some of the factors we identified that may have influenced how Saugatuck became kind of home for all, or queer community. We mentioned the Oxbow School of Art already, which certainly had LGBTQ identifying members from the beginning of its history, but generally kind of more bohemian culture and a group of people that sought to have this space away from the constraints of modern life, right, of the city, coming to this remote beachside community, which the Oxbow School itself is isolated within this small community. Steamship travel, which we've already talked about, close proximity and means of access. And then the Forward Movement Camp, which was connected with the settlement house movement in Chicago, but was, a kind of free-thinking, interracial, class diverse organization or effort that brought people to this camp from 1899 well into the 1970s. And many people had such fondness for this camp and experiences. Many people later retired or came to the Saugatuck Douglas area because of their experiences here. So a sense of this as some of the factors that may have influenced that made Saugatuck distinctive from other places along the lakeshore. Of course, there's steamship travel all along the Great Lakes, but something about it here with these other factors makes sense. Next slide.
Michigan outlawed gross indecency between men.
Yes. Yeah, so the legal history is interesting, if you think of when there's acknowledgement and prohibitions for policing sexuality and sexual behavior, a right for further interpretation and exploration of how those are enforced. The early 20th century period is a difficult one because much of the history is in fact very private and it's not direct. So Florence Hahn was an interior designer and architect. Was credited with sort of introducing modern interior design to the city of Chicago in the 1920s. And her family had a cottage in Pier Grove, which is immediately south of Douglas on the lakeshore. She had a life partner, Mabel James Warren, that she shared her life with for more than 50 years. And some photographs of them in the exhibit, as well as a really wonderful oil portrait of Florence Hahn. And a good example of people we know who were definitely sort of kind of non-conforming in their life. Here's that portrait of Florence Hahn. Quite different from some of the photographs that we have of her and Mabel together. And kind of fascinating to kind of think about in the 1920s what this means to Muslim person, bisexual person. And how do we know, and how do these historians today kind of represent that person in their story without having a clear statement from them of their own declaration of their intent? So kind of a good primer to encourage people to think about those kinds of questions, acknowledging that there are LGBTQ people in every era of human history, how we understand that or how they would choose to describe that may be very different. Next slide.
And that is the challenge of dealing with kind of history like this, is we don't want to apply modern language to situations that, might seem similar, but really kind of weren't.
Could be quite different, right? Exactly. One of our local stories from outside of the immediate Saugatuck Douglas series is the life of Foreman Brown. Foreman Brown grew up in Otsego, Michigan, which is maybe familiar from here. It's kind of north of Kalamazoo. But Foreman Brown is credited as writing sort of the first American novel with a gay protagonist. Better Angel, who writes it with Susan Richard Meeker in 1933. And it's much later in life that he sort of acknowledges that, yes, I'm the author of this book, which is kind of widely known by the 1960s and 1970s. But Brown writes a kind of semi-autobiographical novel of his experience growing up in a small town. Names change, of course, but really describes something very close to his direct experiences in Otsego, in a small town in rural Michigan, in West Michigan, going to the University of Michigan. His experiences there, he's grappling with his sexuality and attraction to men, and his sort of love of a woman, but sort of not connecting for him. And he goes on to live a really creative and fascinating life. He goes to Yale, now to Los Angeles with this puppetry company, Turnabout Theater in Los Angeles, which was really this innovative experimental theater in the 1940s. But a good example to highlight here, I think, because we tend to think of the history of marginalized communities as something that happens on the east or west coast or the major metropolitan area. In fact, these are stories that are, these are Midwestern stories. These are small town stories. Next slide. Bert Tillstrom is not from Saugatuck directly, but he is from Chicago and has a strong connection to Saugatuck. Bert Tillstrom, for many people today, I think is a name not well known, but for people coming of age in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, was an incredibly well-known figure, not so much maybe on site, but for his creative work. He was incredibly innovative, winning puppeteer, and his characters, which we see here on the screen on the left, and holding these great puppets on the right of Kukla and Ollie, were incredibly well known in early television in the 1940s and 1950s, in particular, April. Tillstrom was very connected with the Oxbow School of Art as an artist and as a performance artist as well, and on the board there. But he was a very private person and did not come out publicly in his lifetime, though definitely sort of identified as gay. In the Chicago LGBTQ Hall of Fame today. But was a beloved figure in Saugatuck, had a home in Saugatuck from the 19 through the 1960s until his death in the 1980s. Next slide. And so the exhibit, I think, does a good job of bringing up some of these issues and thinking about, like, how do we understand people's lives and their experiences the balance of, that people today still grapple with, but certainly face really challenging consequences in the 19 pre-Stonewall, for sure, of being able to come out and sort of live. Next slide, just some newspaper clippings in these. They did from the commercial record newspaper of Bertelsmann in town in the 1950s. He did a lot of performances in Saugatuck after his retirement. Next slide.
Seals Lodge for Lonesome Ladies. That's awesome.
Yeah, so a number of places came to light, examples came to light, from interviews, from letters. This is one here that Shady Shore Motel was one that in certain circles was known as Lucille's Lodge for Lonesome Ladies because of sort of welcoming mixed clientele. So not much more to say about that, other than pointing out that in the 1950s and 1960s, this isn't a place that is known, certainly by word of mouth, as somewhere that is accommodating and welcoming. Next slide.
I think her comment about how someone told their friend and it just grew and built, I think is really kind of the underlying story for a lot of the places in, places like Saugatuck.
Yeah, exactly. Word of mouth is really essential for how things work. So next slide. This is likely a gay tolerant drinking establishment, the Tavern, that persisted, that predates the tempo by about a decade. We know not a lot about it, but that it was a place that people mentioned going to, that gay travelers mentioned going to and knowing about. Next slide. Next slide. Actually, go ahead.
Next one.
Yeah.
Because I'm big and had this wig on. It's the 60s.
We described some of this, history already. So next slide. Next slide.
I do really like the double timeline. I think it really does. It's really neat to see kind of how national things were impacting.
Yeah, it was powerful for me, I think, to help people understand that this is very relatable history. That here we are celebrating 50 years of Stonewall Inn, and in the history there, it's like, well, the Blue Tempo had was in that same context, the same period of significance, even if there weren't mass protests and police violence and such a thing. So Douglas News Resort, we've talked about already. It tells us really lots more to say beyond the time that we have this evening, but it's an incredibly rich story because it's a celebratory story that very much fits in this model of progress, but also highlights that Carl and Larry had attempted to buy 2 other establishments prior to buying the old empty motel that becomes Douglas. The city of Saugatuck rejected 3 requests to transfer the liquor license of another property they were going to buy, and they did not want a gay bar, gay club in Saugatuck in 1981. Before 19.
Disco, cabaret, and deluxe rooms. How could you not want to go there?
Right. I mean, it's a party. They brought in part of the appeal was they had Baptist restaurant there. They probably cooked that, very run, they brought in incredible talent as well. So much like the talent that came to be an attraction of the Temple Bar, they're bringing in nationally known acts that were, coming in from, in some cases, were already in Chicago or coming from Chicago and coming out here from those. So Earth Kid was a figure that came performed once. We saw the Weather Girls just a minute ago. That the rubber scenes in the 1980s. They had lots of great theme nights and entertainment. Next slide. This is photographs here. The cafe served small. One other thing, the kind of mixed audience piece. There were sort of definitely Gay Street audience for people coming to the restaurant. The restaurant was really good in the 1980s when there was not quite the culinary scene that there is in the area today. Next slide. So they really built a reputation for the place in those years as somewhere that local people came and spent time as well. But that roadside architecture piece along the Blue Star Highway is really important. This is the property as it is in 1981. You can see it's this kind of 1960s, 1950s, 1960s roadside architecture moment that is, really, predated in 1981, but is available. And so they're able to purchase this, and City of Douglas does allow them to transfer the liquor license, and they're in business. So, next slide.
I'm assuming it doesn't look like that much these days.
It looks quite different. This is the West competition. Dances,
That's interesting because tea dances are really popular on Fire Island too. I'm curious if the name developed here after Fire Island or in conjunction.
For sure. Yeah. Sort of bringing these ideas here to the Midwest and really popular. So
Is he covered? You know what? I don't want to know. I'm good.
and some more recent photographs, and you can see, next slide.
Still attracting the Chicagoans though.
Attracting the Chicagoans, absolutely. But really from across the region, across the country. And the scale of you mentioned changes to the physical building.
Holy cow, yeah.
The scale of the facilities are now far beyond that 1950 and 1960. But very high quality entertainment, and just a good scene. Certainly the theme of the 2000s is really kind of charting the advances and some of the challenges of civil rights for LGBTQ people, both within the community, the success of churches with a clergy, the successes of local representatives in city and local government who are out, but also some challenges to passing anti-discrimination ordinances. So uneven landscape. Next slide.
Well, that sounds like history.
Exactly. Yes. Right, and certainly marriage qualities part of the story. Thousands. And an acknowledgement of businesses owned in the area. More than 100 businesses are LGBTQ owned or applied in some way.
Nice. It's a long list of people.
And it's a long list of the roll call service of people going well back into the 1980s of a local leaders. Yeah, like that. Next one.
Although it is kind of nice that you can get some of the more newer things on there too with Dr. Levine and Pete and all of that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's good to be able to have that context and to point that out. So I'm kind of wrapping up at this point. We were thrilled to be able to open the exhibit and have a big party. That was one thing we were really rooting for, was hoping that conditions would allow that by Labor Day weekend of 2020. We were able to do that. So it was a really good time. This is a photograph of, I mentioned Dr. Jim Schmiedman earlier. This is him and one of our designers, Sally Winters, who did much in the design work for the exhibit, and just a big celebration. A couple hundred people that sort of came together to sort of open the exhibit, just kind of reflect over that history. It's over.
Might as well. Long time coming. I mean, that was what, 16 years since the original project had started?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So lots more work to do. Next slide. We received a lot of local press about the exhibit. We're also really honored to receive an award from the Michigan Museum Association, Mintzler's Prize for the exhibit.
Well deserved.
Next slide. Right Source Magazine, lots of online attention also. The exhibit will be up at least through this year and possibly through to next year as well. With COVID, we had a nice window of time to have our opening, have our party, and that's so great. And then into the fall, after that point in time. That's our pastor and WCC Church, Southside Atlanta.
Was it always planned to have been a multi-year exhibit then?
I think we weren't sure what the response would be entirely, and but I think it makes sense. There's been an interest in should the exhibit travel, could it travel, should there be a larger permanent exhibit, or this translate into a larger exhibit. My idea has been that this was really like a first draft of this history, the timeline form, and hopefully learn more, that we would have sort of more leads and more information, more questions that we could help, we could start to fill out and provide some richer interpretation. There's certainly strong interpretation in the exhibit, but there's, I think, as we're putting this up, even over the course of the year and a half, those things we started to ask more questions. Well, boy, it would be good to understand a little more of how this all came to be, or what explains this sort of reluctance of the community to really embrace, liberation. Why is there this reluctance to pass an anti-discrimination ordinance in the 1990s? In the 2000s,
right?
Why is there reluctance to have Pride Parade? Why is there reluctance to have a rainbow Pride flag in front of City Hall? Like, these are questions worth exploring,
right? I mean, it's the work is never done, but
so a number of other programs that we're able to do to help those. But it's really been an opportunity to start conversations and hopefully more information from what, and hopefully it will be an inspiration for other communities to also look and think in richer ways about their community's history. So thanks for inviting me here, and
well, thank you, Eric. I mean, this is part of what we're trying to do here at the BCHA is expand that history. You know it as well as I do, small museums had a small audience and a small donation audience. So now it's time to expand that. So we hope to eventually follow in your footsteps and also tell the LGBTQ history here of Berrien County. If you're interested in learning more, you can check them out online at sdhistoricalsociety.org. Feel free to reach out to Eric if you got additional questions, or maybe you have stories that connect and would love to share. As always, all museums are looking for artifacts and stories and photos to expand the story that we have. And if you are interested in learning more about the exhibit, they're more than happy to answer any questions I have, but we are delighted to have you here tonight. It's a little dark in here. We got a storm coming, but we still remain quite colorful thanks to the pride flag. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. And keep in mind, this can be seen online on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, probably starting tomorrow. Other than that, if you're in Berrien Springs or in the area, want to pick up some information before you head up, we will be having some of their brochures here at the museum. So stop by and pick some up. Thank you so much, Eric. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everyone, you have a great day, and we will see you at our next one, which will be about the musical history of the House of David in August with Dr. Brian Carroll of the House of David.